The untouched southern Great Plains, for centuries subject to unpredictable weather, relentless wind, and recurrent drought, but in season the richest grazing land on earth. Then came the cattleman, overgrazing and scarring the lush plains grass that held the water in the soil. In 1887, the farmer came, heedlessly ripping away the protective cover of turf that kept the soil from blowing away in time of drought. The dangers of drought were learned, but soon forgotten. The times were good. New settlers came, impressed with the rains and bumper crops. The fertile soil, considered inexhaustible, was taken for granted. Thousands poured into the plains to grab what they could from the soil. Unknowingly, they were creating this area that in the 30s would be called the Dustbowl. Its center, Dalhart, Texas.
My father brought me to the Panhandle in 1890. And in 1913, my brother and I bought this ranch. And for several years, we had a very fine condition. But the farmers came here in the 20s, long about, I'd say about 27 or 28, and they began to buy this land and break it up and plant it into crop, in corn.
All through the 20s, high-paying wheat was the goal. New, faster equipment joined the tractor. Expensive, but a boom was on, credit easy. Farmers and ranchers became gamblers, expanding on credit. More equipment, more land to produce more wheat to pay the bills. As farms became mechanized wheat factories, non-resident suitcase farmers rushed in and out for quick killings, carving out millions of acres of green pasture land, never minding the cost. The good weather, which seemed to go in 10-year cycles, held. The 20s were very good.
Well, the dry weather started at about 30, and then 31 and 32 it got worse, and some of these farmers had livestock. And they didn't have any place to graze these cattle much, and they turned them on these fields. And the little old stuff got about that high, they'd pull it up and eat it. And that left the land bare. And in 1933, it was pretty bad. And about 34, it got real bad. The drought lasted 8 years.
Man's greed and years of careless cultivation now took their toll. The uncovered earth had given all it had to give. It could give no more. As the added ordeal of depression tumbled the price of wheat, the land, mistreated, parched by drought, was pulverized to produce still more wheat. A futile race with the creditor, creating only dust, ready to blow. In the spring of 1934, the winds caught up the broken soil, and a plague of dust descended upon those who had treated the land with ignorance and contempt. Clouds of dust billowed up to 15,000 feet in the air, shutting off the sun, eventually turning day into night. Sand had to be shoveled from railroad tracks before trains could pass. Airplanes were grounded, and a sense of impending doom permeated the cities of the plain, turned into darkness at midday. Topsoil of the country was blowing away, withering vegetation from millions of acres of farmlands, choking the air so that it was painful to breathe without a damp cloth over nose and mouth. This was only the beginning. For those on the southern plains, dust would become a way of life, their land, the Dust Bowl.
Here during the terrible Dust Bowl days. The worst storm that I can remember was the last big duster that rolled in. We stopped by the side of the road and waited until we could see the edge of the road, which was I don't know how long. It seemed like a lifetime. We drove on home, and we found out when we got out we were so short on oxygen we could hardly stand up. And when we got in the house and turned on the light, I told my husband, I said, "Bandit, you can take off your mask now. The sheriff won't be out tonight." He says, "Baby, you better take off yours." So when we got finally cleaned up and started to bed, he dropped his clothes. The only time in all of our married life that he didn't pick them up.
People just didn't know what to think about these storms. I remember one Sunday afternoon, I think it was in 1935 in April, one of the most beautiful Sundays I ever saw, with a blue sky and a bright sun. They were having a funeral in a little church in one corner of the Dust Bowl. At the time the service started, it was a bright blue afternoon. During the service, a big black blizzard came rolling in, silently just tumbling over and over. The first thing you know, it knocked out the sun. It went out just like a light switch, or like Lottie's eye, as we say in Texas. Suddenly it was dark in this church, just as dark almost as night. And the people didn't know what had happened. They'd never seen anything like this. Therefore, they were panicked. Many of them rushed out at the doors, others dived out at the windows, and when it was all over, there's no one left in the church except the minister and the corpse.
I remember one spell out here in the spring of 1934 that my young son had gone out in the pasture to get the cattle out here and get the milk cows. And while he was there, this storm began to roll in great black waves from the north. And I saw it was going to get here before he could get here, and so I thought I'd better go pick him up. He might get lost. So I ran out and picked him up, and he came on, and we just got home here when the storm hit. And everything was black. You couldn't hardly see your hand before your face. It was just a solid black. We lighted the lights in the house, and you couldn't hardly find your way about the house. That storm lasted, as I remember, all night, and it piled sand around the house up there until probably it was 2 foot deep in a big circle right around the house.
We had 110 dust storms that spring. Put out some wheat that fall. Next year it was blowing out. I put my wheat back in. I come out here and went to my field of wheat and sat down on the ground to examine the plants. They were brown. They had been electrocuted. They were dead. Big, healthy plants now electrocuted and dead. And I cried because I was so disappointed. This was my 3rd year. I remember one time I went over to my neighbor's house, and the dirt was just fogging everywhere, and I went in the house, and the room was foggy, and he was over at the dining room table, and you could write your name on the table in the dust, and he was bald-headed and there was dirt on his head. I said, well, what are you doing? And he said, I'm cleaning my alarm clock. I can't do anything else this afternoon.
Of the group hit hardest by the Depression, dependent on government relief, Franklin D. Roosevelt wrote, they were a hopeful people. They were going to see the thing through. But season after season of crop failure and sand began to bury hope. For their starving cattle, they could neither raise feed nor buy it. They drove their herds to greener pastures, but little could be found. The richest grazing land on earth had become a desert. Savings and credit gone, their cattle would be sold at public auction. At these auctions, friends banded together, bidding no more than 5 or 10 cents for a cow they would then return to their foreclosed neighbor in a futile conspiracy against the common disaster.
Get 15 to 1, 15. 15, sold them 15 outside with them. Wait, please, what are you going to get for them? 10 cents. Sold it. Pay out. Out with him! Out with him! 20. Sold her. Outside with her. We'll knock them in the head. They're not worth anything anyway.
In the words of one observer, the country seemed to brood as though death were touching it.
But people stayed and prayed in the Dust Bowl. Of course, praying for rain and always looking forward to next year. Next year would bring rain, it would bring bountiful growth, it would bring harvest. Next year. Always looking for next year. I guess this is the greatest next year country on the face of the earth. But some of the people simply couldn't stay. They had to do something. They had nothing to eat. They were blown out and stormed out and dusted out, and they had to leave. Consequently, they loaded their wives and children and all of their belongings, including mattresses, on top of their jalopies and headed westward for California. We felt awful sorry for these people who were long-faced and grimmed, and tell you what, we weren't eating too high on the hog ourselves there.
Between the years 1935 and 1939, 350,000 people left their homes and farms in the Dust Bowl. With no money and little hope, the refugees from Dust fled the desolate land to join the bewildered legion of the dispossessed, the most numerous of which were those called Okies, primarily tenant farmers from Oklahoma, evicted from the land by large-scale mechanization and absentee ownership. Leaving the land behind, they made for Highway 66, their path of exodus, across mountains and desert to the green promised land, California.
I remember often at the newspaper, between editions, we'd go to the window and look out. Our office looked out right on Highway 66, where it came down and made a turn and went up 6th Street toward Polk Street. These old jalopies would come up and kind of crunch to a stop here at this stoplight, which was one of the few we had in town in those days. And the steam would plume up from the radiators, and it'd be a terrible squeaking, and a lot of the luggage sort of leaned over sidewassy and crooked and every which way. And then when the traffic light would change, here they would go, and the wheels would squeak, and you'd wonder how the tires would last for a mile. They must have lasted, because many of these people did make it to California. We'd see them coming in a few, and in sometime as many as 10 and 20 cars at a time.
In his controversial novel, The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck called national attention to the plight of these people. He wrote, "They took the migrant way to the west. In the daylight, they scuttled like bugs to the westward. And as the dark caught them, they clustered like bugs near to shelter and to water. And because they were lonely and perplexed, because they had all come from a place of sadness and worry and defeat, and because they were all going to a new, mysterious place, they huddled together, they talked together, they shared their lives, their food, and the things they hoped for in the new country. 20 families became one family. The children were the children of all. The loss of home became one loss, and the golden time in the West was one dream." they talked of the land behind them, wrote Steinbeck. Maybe, they thought, maybe we sinned some way we didn't know about. They were not farm men anymore, but migrant men. And the thought, the planning, the long, staring silence that had gone out to the fields went now to the roads, to the distance, to the west. The promised land proved a tragic delusion. Instead of homes and farms and jobs, they would find miserable squatter camps, shanty towns, political tensions, and an already glutted labor market. What work they found would not be as farmers, but as migrant hands. They were met with fear of their number, prejudice for their poverty. They were suspect, threats, to be met with vigilante tactics. Measures were taken to keep them out, to turn them back. Bills introduced to bar all transients, vagrancy sentences, bum blockades. And still they came, in flight from dust and despair, to the land of promise which held none for them.
Despite the tragedy of the Dustbowl, all of this was certainly a blessing in disguise. These dramatic black blizzards sweeping down and terrorizing the people and ruining the soil dramatized the mistreatment of land and soil all over the nation. And it brought us our first national farm program, which was based on soil conservation.
Government experts taught the farmer how to revive and protect the soil. In a long-range conservation program, he was taught new ways of planting and plowing that would hold the moisture in the land when the rains stopped, that would keep it from blowing when the winds came. At Dalhart, Texas, the Last Man's Club had been formed, pledging to stay with the land, determined to see it rich and green again.
I stayed here because I didn't think this country was completely ruined and it would come back someday. And I thought the man that stayed here would be the man that'd have his feet on the ground and would be ahead. And it proved to be that way. And I think we have the thing licked now. I don't think we'll ever see it in more Dustbowl days. Anyway, we fought this thing for a number of years before we began to produce wheat. Then when we did, during the 40s, we raised lots of wheat during the war years. And beginning with the 50s, we started going into another dry period. Well, we had 2 or 3 wheat failures. Then we started to develop irrigation here. And I think that now we have our country under control. I don't believe we'll be bothered anymore with dust storms.
A third of the population had fled the Dust Bowl. The farmers and ranchers who stayed and survived know that there is one thing on which they can depend. Dry weather will come again.
I think we know so much more about it now. They're not going to expose their land. Everybody's conscious now, and they say, let's keep our land covered up so it won't blow. And I think that, and then we don't, just like here, I've got this land all fenced around here in pasture so it'll never get tramped around here and blow up. All that pasture land there and all this land blew up just like a field because I'd been careless and overstocked it, see? We won't do that anymore. I think we've learned a lot about how to take care of our land.
In redeeming the land, the people of the Southern Plains have redeemed themselves. They have found that this is the promised land.